Rock is undoubtedly one of the most influential genres in the music scene worldwide, in part thanks to the countless vocalists who have contributed their spectacular talent, becoming key pieces to take this great genre to another level.
Down the street, way down low. Ain't no sound but the sound of his feet. Machine guns ready to go.
In fact, there are several names that resonate in the heads of fans every time they think about who are the best singers in the history of the genre. Today, we take a moment to honor the lives of the greatest of them all, the rock and roll singers who elevated their bands to stratospheric heights and inspired entire generations of vocalists to follow the paths they blazed.
I feel inside, can't explain a certain kind. Nobody can take my car, I'm gonna race into the ground. Nobody can breathe it. Rest his head on a pillow made of concrete. Again.
To put together this ranking, we've taken into account the 7 decades of rock history and selected the artists who, with their singing, songwriting, ineffable live charisma, and particularly their indefinable presence, have done the best job of spreading the gospel of music to all corners of the world, serving as spokespersons for their bands and the genre. We hope you will be entertained along this musical journey, and that your favorite rock singer will have his or her respective appearance. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on the content we'll be putting out each week. Thank you very much. Few voices have left such a profound impact on the music industry as Chris Cornell. Both his heartbreaking compositions and his mind-blowing live performances positioned him as a pioneer within grunge, as well as one of the most virtuosic voices in the history of rock and roll. Cornell's departure at the age of 52 left a huge void, but given the circumstances, it seemed like the end of a period of pain and suffering that the artist carried throughout his life, and that, at every opportunity, he captured in his various projects with an intensity unique in its kind. With Soundgarden, Temple of the Dog, Audioslave, or on his own, Cornell left us some of the most famous hymns in contemporary music. Christopher Boyle, later known as Chris Cornell, was born on July 20, 1964 in Seattle, United States. Raised in a family of separated parents, in his puberty he began to feel the first signs of depression that would accompany him throughout his life. Playing the piano, a hobby he had acquired at a very young age, helped him to cope with the backpack he felt on his shoulders as a young man. However, he spent almost a year of reclusion at home for this reason, which led him to abandon piano lessons, but he got completely into guitar and singing in a self-taught way. As a teenager, he played in a few bands, such as the Jones Street Band, with which he and bassist Hiro Yamamoto played covers of other famous bands, such as Ramones and AC/DC. But it wasn't until he was 20 years old that he formed the band that would give him recognition for eternity, Soundgarden. Soundgarden was the first of the big four grunge bands to release a studio album. In 1988, they released Ultra Mega OK, an album that sounded heavy, but that began to have certain nuances that would later be defined in the first half of the 90s, when grunge was installed as a genre in itself. The first 3 albums of the band would be the rawest, until the 4th album of 1994, Super Unknown, where the sound of the LP already became grunge, leaving behind the heavier metal facet of the previous works.
Won't you come, wash away.
The band knew how to take advantage of the success they enjoyed at that time, thanks to the fact that their music videos ran on MTV most of the day, and Cornell's videos reached an unusual massiveness. But in spite of this, Cornell continued with his depression, increased by the consumption of drugs and alcohol, which motivated a series of internal conflicts in the group that, finally, announced its separation on April 9, 1997. Outside Soundgarden, in 1991 he recorded an album with his friend Eddie Vedder in the project called Temple of the Dog, but after the separation of the group, he ventured into several projects ranging from his solo albums to the other great group that gave him recognition in another stage of his life, Audioslave. With Audioslave, Chris recorded 3 albums that worked very well, with a few hits, and with an enviable chemistry between all the members. The band broke up in 2007 and had a reunion 10 years later to speak out against the then newly elected president of the United States, Donald Trump. Cornell released several solo albums, which did not do justice to the vocal and compositional quality of the Soundgarden or Audioslave eras, but anyway, it was enough for him to tour the world with his great voice and a guitar. Despite these sayings, sadly on May 18, 2017, Chris took his own life in a hotel room in the middle of a tour with Soundgarden. Remembered for his ability to convey deep emotions through his voice and his innovative approach to musical composition, Chris Cornell overcame 1,000 obstacles in life and succeeded in music with everything he undertook. However, he could not win the battle against his own demons. Chester Bennington was one of the most expressive and recognized voices of rock since the early 2000s. Hymns like In the End or Numb sounded and still sound strongly, with Chester Bennington's voice as the protagonist. He was the lead singer of the band Linkin Park, one of the most recognized alternative rock bands of the last decades, which has sold more than 60 million copies worldwide and has won 2 Grammy Awards, among the greatest recognitions to his career. His unique voice was one of the most imitated by contemporary musicians, but none of his contemporaries managed to perform with the same comfort in different genres such as alternative rock, grunge, and even pop. Perhaps, this recognition and success served Chester Bennington to hide all the sadness that was in his life, which from a very early age was stained and damaged by sexual abuse, which he lived from the age of 7 to 13 years old. In that period, he also had to live through his parents' divorce when he was 11 years old, which even led him to abuse drugs. In addition, he was bullied at school, receiving beatings and mockery. Chester Bennington was born on March 20, 1976 in Arizona, United States, so today he would be 48 years old. However, the problems he experienced as a child and during adolescence were stronger than his desire to live life. His beginnings in the music world date back from 1993 to 1998, when he was inspired by bands such as Depeche Mode and Stone Temple Pilots. In that period, he was part of 2 bands that did not have significant success. Frustrated and wanting to leave music aside, he met Jeff Blue in 1999 and went to Los Angeles to audition for a band called Zero, who would later become Linkin Park. Already with Chester leading the vocals, they signed with the music label Warner Brothers Records. For the year 2000, when Chester was just 24 years old, came to market Hybrid Theory, debut album with his band Linkin Park. The album was a resounding success since its release, selling more than 10 million copies, and is considered to this day as one of the best debuts in the history of music. The album stood out thanks to a unique sound, where rap rhythms by Mike Shinoda were combined with Chester's heartbreaking voice, but also with raw lyrics that, in retrospect, were clues to the deep depression in which the prodigious vocalist was immersed since his early years. Linkin Park became a global phenomenon with 7 studio albums, which pleased both critics and fans. However, all this success was not enough for Chester to be at peace with his demons. To understand the mind of this artist, it is important to go back to his childhood, because from the age of 7, he was a victim of sexual abuse by a friend of his. Chester kept silent out of fear and shame, so this abuse continued until the musician was 13 years old. Bennington confessed that it was this unfortunate event, and the consequences on his mental state, which led him to take refuge in all kinds of drugs and alcohol, which were part of his daily diet for many years. As the artist he was, all this suffering was transferred to his music, where Chester shared his pain in the lyrics of his songs. Chester continued to grow artistically, both with Linkin Park and in other projects outside the group. Everyone around him saw a huge potential in Chester from a young age. They did not see a tortured mind, they saw a kid with a lot of talent, and with all the attitude to become a real rock star. Sadly, the vocalist decided to commit suicide on July 20, 2017, at his home in Palos Verdes, California. That day, the musician's housekeeper found him dead in his home, and shortly after his death was ruled a suicide by hanging. This happened after spending a vacation with his wife and family in Arizona. Chester Bennington decided to return to his residence alone, claiming he had work to do. He had relapsed again into drugs and alcoholism, coupled with his stormy past, but mainly the fact that that day would have been Chris Cornell's 53rd birthday, who had very little time after committing suicide, and with whom he had a very close friendship for years. Apparently, all this was reason enough to decide to take his own life at the height of his career, in the middle of a tour with Linkin Park, and at the top of the music scene. Chester left no note to explain why he did what he did, however, when you dig into his life, but, above all, his art, the suicide letters seem to have always been there, as if Bennington had been a ticking time bomb, just looking for the perfect moment to immolate himself. Perhaps Cornell's death acted as a push, as that which prompted him to do what he always wanted to do, say goodbye.
Back in 1955, man didn't know about a rock and roll show.
On a cold London morning in 1980, the lifeless body of Bon Scott, lead singer of what was then just beginning to become the successful rock band AC/DC, was found in a Renault 5. More than 4 decades later, his death is still surrounded by inaccuracies and questions. Iconic and charismatic figure, Bon Scott had a short life marked by debauchery, always on the edge. His excessive consumption of alcohol and drugs was the trigger for his tragic end. Almost unanimously considered one of the best frontmen in rock history, he had immigrated as a child from Scotland to Australia. There, almost since his arrival, he had been forging a rebellious and rocky character in an extremely hostile environment. He dropped out of school at the age of 15 and tried to get by as best he could with all kinds of jobs, almost always weighed down by a character and a lifestyle that caused him, for example, to be expelled from the army. Scott was attracted to rock music from an early age. The young brothers Angus and Malcolm Young, also Scottish immigrants to Australia, were looking for a vocalist for their band, and Scott, who worked for them as a driver, was suggested. After overcoming initial mutual reluctance, Scott's arrival would coincide with the takeoff of the band that, until then, had a discrete trajectory, mainly based on versions of rock classics. The release in 1975 of AC/DC's debut album in Australia, High Voltage, would mark the beginning of an ascending line for the band, and would also coincide with Bon Scott's first heroin overdose. During the following 4 years, until culminating with the landing in the North American charts with Highway to Hell, their 6th album, everything surrounding the band was pure vertigo and adrenaline. Bon Scott had assured on several occasions his conviction that he would not reach the age of 40 alive. His excessive alcohol intake, his flirtation with drugs, and his penchant for endless partying did not bode well. Just at the time when AC/DC was beginning to gain popularity and success, the deadly end came for the 33-year-old frontman. In the early morning of Tuesday, February 19, 1980, Bon went to the Music Machine in Camden and left the place around 3 o'clock in the morning with his friend Alastair Kinnear, who took him to his apartment by car. During the trip, Kinnear noticed that Bon fell asleep, but upon arriving at the destination, he was unable to wake him up or even get him out of the car, so he took him home and left him to sleep in the vehicle. 15 hours later, he returned to the car, but now terrified as Bon was totally unconscious. He immediately took him to the nearest hospital, although it was too late. Scott used to abuse alcohol, and this time he was unlucky, dying of alcohol poisoning and bronchial aspiration. He was buried in the cemetery of Fremantle, Australia, and his grave has become one of the cultural icons of the country. The band considered at one point whether or not to continue, but finally, they added Brian Johnson as a new vocalist to record Back in Black, an album that has a completely black cover as a sign of mourning, and sold nearly 50 million copies, becoming the second best-selling album in the history of music. An outspoken opponent of sexism, sexual aggression, racism, and homophobia, his controversial lifestyle, charisma, incredible talent, and untimely death have made him a legend and one of the most influential figures in the history of music. Throughout his life, he struggled with depression, which began at the age of 9 with his parents' divorce. He also suffered from bronchitis, laryngitis, and chronic stomach pains, in addition to drug and alcohol addiction.
Come and
Yes, you are. Yes, you were. Yes,
Proclaimed by experts as the leader of Generation X, he never felt comfortable in that role. In fact, he came to harbor resentment against people who claimed to be Nirvana fans, but misunderstood his social views. Kurt Donald Cobain was born on February 20, 1967, in a small town outside the remote city of Aberdeen, Washington. He was the first son of Donald, a mechanic, and Wendy, a housewife who later worked as a secretary. 3 years later, the arrival of his sister Kim completed the family. Kurt's earliest memories are extremely happy ones. He was an inquisitive, energetic child, the center of attention. He sang, drew, performed at family gatherings, and enjoyed extracting rhythms from a small children's drum kit. Then, before his 8th birthday, his world changed drastically. His mother filed for divorce, an action his father protested futilely and bitterly. Taciturn and introverted, Kurt lived with his mother for a year before moving in with his father. Compounding the problem of his family life was the fact that his home was a mobile home on the outskirts of Aberdeen, a dull community of lumberjacks, not exactly known for its sympathetic attitude toward delicate, artistically curious boys. Because he was often sick, Cobain was given Ritalin to counteract his hyperactivity. Later, he was diagnosed with chronic bronchitis and mild scoliosis. Still, his weak frame was overshadowed by his stubborn nature. Circumstances worsened when his father remarried a woman with 2 children. Unable to bear the situation, a year later he left his father's home, wandered aimlessly for a few months, and finally went to live with his mother. There, too, he found no family warmth. He could not suffer the new boyfriend with whom his mother, who was then rolling down the slope of alcoholism, was living. The adolescent Kurt took refuge from all these problems in a guitar that his uncle gave him, although later he would begin to have his first contacts with drugs. Meanwhile, punk rock was boiling, and that music sounded exactly how Cobain felt, desperate, angry, and raw. He dropped out of high school, so his mother kicked him out of the house, and for a while, he got to live under a bridge. He talked to his friend Chris Novoselic about starting a band, and a couple of years and name changes later, Nirvana was born. By 1988, Nirvana had recorded a series of demos and released their first single, Love Buzz, Big Cheese, under Sub Pop Records, the label that boasted of capturing the Seattle sound. By 1989, the band's debut album, Bleach, recorded for $600, proved that something different was happening. It was frightening and abrasive, but possessed a quality that was strangely familiar, almost welcoming. The band went on tour, replaced drummer Chad Channing with Dave Grohl, and went back to recording. That's when the real magic happened. Nevermind was released in September 1991, without much fuss or expectation. The album managed to sell some 50 million copies worldwide, resulting in a profit of some $550 million, making the band members overnight millionaires. Plagued by the conflicts of its composer, the music presented Kurt Cobain in front of the world.
and I forget just why today's
But offstage, Cobain was famously moody and introspective, and the actions unfolding around him often spoke louder than he did. Nirvana was changing the face of 90s music, and no matter how much he tried to curl up on the sidelines out of the spotlight, he was always in the eye of the storm. He picked up a drug habit that would plague him until his final days, and his affair with Courtney Love left a pile of stories that scattered many theories around him. Months after her marriage in September 1992 in Hawaii, and a couple of weeks after the birth of her daughter, Frances Bean, Courtney Love confessed to Vanity Fair magazine that she had taken heroin during her pregnancy. MTV Unplugged, which is considered one of the best acoustic shows in history, was recorded in New York on November 18, 1993, and aired on MTV on December 16 of the same year. It is notable for its intimate atmosphere and emotional interpretation of Nirvana's songs in an unplugged format, which allowed for a new appreciation of their music. The band played a repertoire that included some of their best-known songs, as well as some covers of songs by other artists.
I laughed and shook his hand. I made my way back home.
On March 4, 1994, Cobain was admitted to the hospital in a coma after a failed suicide attempt by taking a cocktail of drugs. This suicide attempt was officially considered an accident, but his family and friends knew the truth. Days after he recovered, Kurt returned to Seattle. Back in Seattle, Kurt feared for his life, which is why he bought a shotgun for safety. The leader of Nirvana, who became the biggest rock star of the 90s, and for whom millions of young people cried until exhaustion that fateful day, never knew how to handle the pressure of a life full of fame and excesses, which were responsible for killing him silently. His death, which shocked the whole world, gave rise to countless conspiracy theories and propitiated the birth of a myth.
That it would be untrue. You know that I would be a liar.
Rock star, poet, and sex symbol, 50 years after his death, the myth of Jim Morrison has lost none of its fascination. In the few years of his life, he became one of the icons of rock, through his voice, his poetry, and as an expression of the phenomena that went through the 1960s. On December 8, 1943, James Douglas Morrison was born in Melbourne, United States. He would die only 27 years after his birth, in July 1971. However, he would become one of the greatest legends in the history of rock. In 2011, Rolling Stone magazine placed Jim Morrison in 47th place on the list of the greatest singers of all time, while Classic Rock magazine ranked him among the top 20. The Lizard King, such was one of his nicknames, was born into a particular family. His father was a high admiral in the U.S. Navy. That led Jim to live in several military bases and cities of his country. It is believed that this kind of life, without attachment to places or people, deeply influenced his way of being. He wrote poetry, did some painting, and read voraciously. After becoming independent at an early age, he studied film in Los Angeles, where he lived on the beach, and devoted himself, body and soul, to his true vocation, poetry. This was a time of discoveries for Jim Morrison. On the one hand, the approach to psychedelic substances that fascinated him so much, and on the other hand, the birth of the hippie culture, which flourished everywhere, and with which he lived surrounded until the end of his life. In spite of his innumerable lovers, he was always by the side of Pamela Courson, who forgave him his infidelities. Jim Morrison said of her that she was his soulmate, his cosmic love. His vision of the world was somewhat distant from fundamental hippie issues, such as the approach to the spirit through meditation, vegetarianism, or astrology. He read texts that were complex for most people. With the intention of setting some of his work to music, he came to Ray Manzarek, a rock musician. After Ray asked Jim to interpret some of those verses, he was surprised by the musicality he put into the compositions. It was then, when Manzarek asked him to join a new musical group he was putting together, where Jim accepted immediately. Thus began the history of The Doors. Morrison on vocals, Ray Manzarek on keyboards, Robbie Krieger on guitar, and John Densmore on drums. The beginning of Jim's artistic career is a brief but intense story. A pillar of psychedelia for some, an emblem of classic rock for others. The truth is that Jim Morrison, at some point, was something like the first frontman of a rock band, with all that implied in that context. In 1967, the band's first album was released under the title The Doors, which was a tremendous success, reaching the top of all the music charts, including Billboard.
You know the day destroys the night, night divides the day.
That it would be untrue. You know that I would be a liar.
It is worth noting the marked change that Morrison underwent until he became the star of the group. During his childhood and adolescence, he had many personality problems, which made him a very insecure person. His greatest influence, as a singer and in terms of stage presence, was Elvis Presley, whom he never met or saw in concert, but whose repertoire he knew practically everything, which he performed many times in his live concerts. His biggest obstacle to joining the group was that he suffered from stage fright. In the first concerts he would even sing with his back to the audience, even consuming different substances to avoid this insecurity. Drugs had such an impact on him that he became an expert on the subject, becoming interested in shamanism, given his close relationship with peyote. Vocally, Morrison was a whirlwind, shouting, moaning, and melodically chortling. When the poet appeared to him, he verbalized everything that came spontaneously. His provocative attitude on stage, disturbing public order, caused his concerts to be banned in several cities in the United States. On one such occasion, the singer was arrested in the middle of a concert on charges of indecent exposure, profanity, public drunkenness, and obscene behavior. In his last 2 years of life, Jim Morrison reduced his use of psychedelic drugs and began to drink excessively, which soon affected his performance in the studio. Jim Morrison, at that time, was disgusted with the music industry and turned all his artistic efforts into what he liked the most, literature. To continue his fledgling literary career, he moved with his girlfriend Pamela Courson to one of the world's cultural cradles, the beautiful city of Paris. At this time, his health was already very deteriorated due to the sedentary life he was leading and the excessive consumption of substances, both legal and illegal. Jim often coughed up blood, as on the night of July 2nd to 3rd. His girlfriend, as she often did, ran him a bath, and he went back to sleep. An hour later, he woke up to find Jim Morrison lifeless in the bathtub of his Parisian apartment from a heart attack. At least, that is the official version. Many fans and biographers believe that Courson invented this story since she was addicted to more dangerous substances. It is said that Morrison consumed with her and died of an overdose, but as the exact cause of his death was not investigated, it was concluded that the Lizard King died of a heart attack. The singer's body was buried in the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, which has become one of the most visited in the city, to such an extent that the authorities had to build a protective fence to prevent people from getting too close. To date, the causes of his death are still unclear. What is certain is that Jim Morrison will go down in history as one of the most eccentric, multifaceted, and controversial artists of the 20th century. In the late 1980s, Axl's remarkable vocal skills and live presence stood out from the rest and made him a dominant force in hard rock. Evoking strong emotions and delivering a lot of energy through his songs, Rose hit powerful high notes on heartbreaking rocks, but also showed his full range on unforgettable ballads. Axl Rose is, without a doubt, one of the most important names in the history of music and rock. This young man, born in Indiana, was able to create together with his bandmates one of the most iconic bands of this genre, such as Guns N' Roses. Most of the band's fans highlight Axl Rose's energy, explosion, and strength as frontman for the band's success formula. At the age of 17, he knew he wanted to form a band and become a rock star. He was constantly getting drunk and was arrested by the police on several occasions. Once, someone told Axl that he behaved like a 2-year-old boy, since his screams, whims, and arbitrary rudeness were those of someone of that age. He replied that this was true. The explanation, according to him, lay in what he had discovered with regressive therapy. His biological father had abused him and his mother. Axl found in that moment the explanation for his behaviors, for his long life of perpetual conflict. After moving to Los Angeles, he tried to make his way in music while integrating several bands with his best friend, Izzy Stradlin. One of them was LA Guns, which would later become Guns N' Roses. After signing a contract with Geffen Records, they entered the studio. First they released an EP with 4 songs, until, in 1987, they released Appetite for Destruction. The album did not have too much repercussion in the first months, selling little more than 200,000 copies. Not bad for a new band, it showed their potential. However, neither radio stations nor MTV played their songs. The label decided to focus on other artists who were performing better, until a manager asked MTV for one last chance. He arranged for the Welcome to the Jungle video to be played on 3 consecutive nights. Those 3 runs of the clip unleashed the phenomenon. The album, almost a year after its release, reached number 1. Over the years, it became the best-selling debut of a band in the United States, with more than 30 million copies, adding that the songs Paradise City and Sweet Child of Mine also became hits. Provocation marked the band's style, which had lyrics branded as misogynistic and racist. However, in the 80s and early 90s, that did not close doors for them. On the contrary, fans from all over the world were attracted by that marginal spirit. At the same time, Axl was on the covers of music magazines, but he was also in the news for his scandals with the police. He was arrested in St. Louis after violent incidents during one of the band's concerts. This problematic behavior of Axl made the relationship with his group more delicate. In 1991, after the release of the albums Use Your Illusion I and Use Your Illusion 2, Izzy Stradlin left the band. In the following 2 years, the rest of the members also said goodbye to the group. Some interviews show that there were 2 main reasons for the departures. First, Axl began to fall behind in the concerts and to abuse drugs. Also, he started to make decisions about the future of the band without consulting his bandmates. After that, he even tried to replace his old equipment, but was unsuccessful. In the end, Axl managed to buy the name and all the rights to the band, being the current owner of the songs. Today, Axl Rose lives in seclusion in his Malibu mansion. From there, he gives his opinion on social networks and plans new recordings and a return to the stage, having become a rock legend, a representative of the past, of a time that seems near, but that will never come back.
Now there you go again, you say you want your freedom.
The only woman in this ranking, it couldn't be anyone else. Much has been said about Stevie Nicks' magical vibe over the past 5 decades, and there really is something enchanting about the Fleetwood Mac frontwoman. Whether on stage, or in a room full of some of the most talented musicians of a generation, Nicks couldn't help but stand out with her floating layers, and a voice that presented enough grit to sand the roughest exteriors. The songs Nicks contributed to the group are not only among the band's best, but also among the most enduring pop culture staples of the 70s and 80s, with an ability to tap into the deepest crevices of her own soul to mesmerize and haunt listeners in a way no other singer could ever hope to match. With 140 million records sold, 40 singles on the charts, and countless Grammys, Stevie Nicks is the only woman to be inducted twice into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Born in Phoenix, Arizona, as Stephanie Lynn Nicks on May 26, 1948, she fell in love with the American folk repertoire early on and launched herself into the world of music. In the late 1960s, renamed Stevie, she moved to San Francisco with a dream. The city was privileged to see the birth of one of the most epic couples in the music world. The duo of Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks embarked on the flight of a creative and loving relationship that would lead them to the doorstep of the band that completely changed their lives. When the English musician Mick Fleetwood is set in Buckingham as a candidate for new guitarist of his group, he only puts a condition: to continue next to Stevie. The arrival of Stevie Nicks completely renews the band's image, and her participation is enhanced by the presence of keyboardist, vocalist, and composer Christine McVie. Certainly, Fleetwood Mac's lineup is particular for the time. In it, 2 female composers stand out as decisive pieces in the new sound of the band, a sound that will be reflected in the album of the same name in 1975, later consolidated with Rumors, in 1977, the great work of that era, and finally, with the release of Tusk, in 1978, a trilogy where McVie and Nicks, together with Buckingham, are the authors of the most outstanding songs of the band. In the recordings of the second album of the group, Rumors, Stevie underwent an abortion, since, in his own words, "If I didn't have an abortion, I'm absolutely sure there would have been no Fleetwood Mac." Album after album, Nicks excelled as a vocalist and songwriter, becoming an icon for generations of musicians and audiences to come. Entering the 80s, the Fleetwood Mac phenomenon began to weaken due to internal conflicts, both for the group's successes and addictions, as well as for Stevie and Buckingham's resounding breakup. In spite of everything, Nicks, who did not lack energy, decided that it was not time to stop, and released her debut album Belladonna. She found a niche in the music industry of the 70s and 80s, introducing the feminine imaginary in the raw and masculine world of rock, and putting the emotional and lyrical universe of her compositions at the forefront. Being the only woman inducted twice into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is, of course, one of the reasons for her legend. First, she did it with Fleetwood Mac in 1998, and then for her solo career in 2019, reminding us of a historical and current feminist coup in the world of music.
Lying beside you, yeah.
Steve Perry is one of the singers who captivates with his great voice. A voice that led him to success, and that we remember when he was the vocalist of the best melodic rock band of all time, Journey, commonly discredited by the most serious music fans. The Journey Rockers were one of the many commercial phenomena of the late 70s and early 80s, when they sold more than 50 million copies worldwide. Steve Perry, born in 1949 in Fresno, California, was interested in music from an early age. At the age of 25, he was already the lead singer of a band called Alien Project, but after the death in a car accident of the group's bassist, grief-stricken by the tragedy, Perry decided to abandon his musical career and work on a turkey farm and in his stepfather's construction business. However, Steve Perry's departure from music would be momentary. On his mother's recommendation, Perry would answer a call from Walter Herbert, manager of a San Francisco progressive rock band called Journey. Herbert, after hearing a demo of a song sung by Perry, impressed by his warm and powerful countertenor voice, decided to hire him to replace the former singer of his band, as he wanted Journey to leave behind its progressive and jazz sound and adopt a more melodic and popular sound, similar to bands like Boston and Foreigner. The group's first album, Infinity, released in 1978, included Lights, a song composed by Steve himself, which began to be played progressively on American radio stations, and which would become, as time went by, the group's first great classic. After the release of the album's Evolution in 1979 and Departure in 1980, Steve Perry and Journey would release Escape in 1981, the album that would consecrate them internationally, and that would reach #1 in the Billboard album charts, thanks to the radio impact of the singles Open Arms and Don't Stop Believin', a single that would become the band's greatest hit, and that would remain for 6 weeks at #2 on the Billboard Hot 100.
Don't stop believing.
Journey would release Frontiers in 1983, and, after the promotional tour of that album, Perry would release Street Talk, his first solo album. Street Talk would become a worldwide success, obtaining a double platinum record thanks to its 2 million copies sold. In 1985, Steve Perry would appear in the megaband USA for Africa, recording with other shining stars of American music, such as Michael Jackson, Lionel Richie, Ray Charles, Bob Dylan, and Bruce Springsteen. By that time, Perry had become one of the most popular voices in American music. From then on, to the bewilderment of his millions of fans around the world, Perry plunged into a prolonged musical ostracism, which would last 24 years. Steve Perry would finally release in October 2018 Traces, his third solo album, in his long-awaited return to music, and to the great delight of his millions of fans, who had to wait almost 2.5 decades to see him back behind a microphone. Robert Plant was the lead singer of the legendary British rock band Led Zeppelin, and his work as a composer is also felt in the band's songs. With Led Zeppelin, Plant not only contributed to the creation of some of the most memorable songs in rock history, such as Stairway to Heaven, but also established a vocal style that would define the sound of hard rock and heavy metal. In 2006, he was voted the greatest metal vocalist of all time by Hit Parader magazine, while Rolling Stone magazine ranked him 15th on its list of the greatest singers of all time in 2008. Led Zeppelin's voice, from his peak to his maturity, had a life of excesses, women, and drugs. The success, the craziness of touring, and the fans in the hotels were his normality, but suddenly, different tragedies struck him, and the death of Carrick, his youngest son of 5 years, pushed him to change forever. Before arriving at Led Zeppelin, many things happened in Robert Plant's life. He was born on August 20th, 1948 in West Bromwich, England. At the age of 16, he left home and sang for some blues bands in the city. Robert Plant worked at various jobs to make ends meet while striving to learn all the ins and outs of the music world. Thus, he worked laying asphalt on roads and in the Woolworths chain of stores. While he was learning his way around, he began to participate in some recordings, usually for other more popular bands. At this time, he began to get in touch with drummer John Bonham, as both played in the group Band of Joy, and performed a kind of fusion between blues and psychedelic music, which was beginning to become fashionable in England. In 1968, Robert Plant met guitarist Jimmy Page, who had participated in the Yardbirds, and who was looking for musicians to create a new band. Plant offered him an audition, where he played the song Somebody to Love by Jefferson Airplane. Page liked the result, because he proposed him to be the vocalist of his new band. Robert Plant began to work as a composer with Page on new songs, although for the moment the idea was different. As the Yardbirds disappeared abruptly, and contracts for some performances remained, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant joined the group to the drummer John Bonham, by recommendation of this last one. To complete the lineup, they hired John Paul Jones, who had previously worked with Page. Led Zeppelin's debut came on January 12, 1969, with their eponymous album, considered by many as the precursor of heavy metal. By then, the commercial results were already spectacular.
How many more times?
Although Robert Plant's participation in the creation of the songs of the group's first album was not credited, that doubt disappeared in the band's second studio work, Led Zeppelin II, released in October 1969, under the label Atlantic Records. In this album, most of the songs were composed by the duo Robert Plant-Jimmy Page, and it was the first to reach the first position in the British and American charts, selling more than 12 million copies, and being considered one of the most influential albums in the history of music.
You need cooling, baby, I'm not fooling.
Robert Plant contributed to Led Zeppelin's lyrics an esoteric and mystical touch, with allusions to mythology and literature. For example, some of his songs are inspired by the books of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, with obvious allusions to their characters. Restless to be inspired by new trends, he did not hesitate to travel to Wales to learn about Welsh mythology, knowledge that was reflected in the band's subsequent albums. In 1975, Robert Plant and his wife were involved in a serious car accident on the Greek island of Rhodes. The aftereffects and the recovery caused that Plant delayed in an important way, the appearance of which was going to be the seventh album of Led Zeppelin, forcing them to cancel numerous performances. In 1977, his son Carrick died when he was only 5 years old, while the musician was on tour in the United States. The pain he suffered led him to seclude himself in his Midlands home, questioning his future. As he began to come to terms with the loss of his son, Plant dedicated some of his best songs to him, such as All My Love, a track that appears on Led Zeppelin's last studio album, 1979's And Through the Outdoor. In December 1980, Led Zeppelin disbanded after the death of the band's drummer, John Bonham, following a wild night of drinking at Jimmy Page's house. The rest of the band, unable to bear the absence of their partner for so many years, decided to go their separate ways. In the following years, Plant continued with his solo career, meeting on certain special occasions with Jimmy Page, and even with John Paul Jones. One of the most memorable was in 1988, when they played at the Atlantic Records' 40th anniversary party. Robert Plant has left an invaluable legacy in the development and evolution of rock, taking it to a high level. He is cataloged as one of the best rock vocalists of all times. For many, he is even the best. For the magic of his voice, his lyrics, and compositions that have touched millions of hearts around the world, Robert Plant, without a doubt, deserves to be at the top of this ranking.
said, what you said, but I said, double that again. I'm not working for the pen.
Place where nobody knows. The sound of gunfire off in the distance. Whose word is on? Set the judgment all wrong. Inside.
See the stone set in your eyes. See the thorn twist in your side.
I don't believe that anybody feels the way I tell about you now.
I rose out of my seat. I just had to dance. Started moving my feet.
Guns for hire, even if we're just dancing in the dark.
Concrete. I'm a lonely man who knows just what it means to lose control. How do I get you alive?
Tommy used to work on the docks. They be on shack. He's down on his luck. It's tough. Buddy, you're a boy, make a big noise, play it in the street. Gonna be a big man someday.
Freddie Mercury was a British singer and composer who achieved worldwide fame as the lead singer and pianist of the rock band Queen. The energy and spectacular staging of live concerts and a successful renewal of the genre through the assimilation of various trends into rock, from jazz to symphonic, explain the deserved and overwhelming triumph of the group, without discounting, of course, the extraordinary intuition and musical creativity of its leader, Freddie Mercury, who developed in parallel an acclaimed solo career. Neither his real name was Freddie Mercury, nor did he come to the world in the United Kingdom, the country where he triumphed. His name was Farrokh Bulsara, and he was born on September 5, 1946, on the island of Zanzibar, located on the east coast of Africa and famous for its spice production. This genius has been, and continues to be, one of the most influential artists in the musical history of the 20th century, and one of the greatest icons of the homosexual collective. Of Iranian origin and Zoroastrian religion, because of his father's work in the Secretary of State for the Colonies, at the age of 7 he was sent to Bombay, India, to study in a British-style boarding school, where his teachers soon discovered his musical talent, suggesting to his parents that he begin to teach music, specifically piano. At the age of 17, Freddie moved to England, where he met Brian May and Roger Taylor. In 1970, they proposed Freddie to join their band, called Smile at the time. Freddie insisted on renaming the band, and it was his idea to baptize it as Queen. At the same time, he changed his artistic surname, and became from that moment on Freddie Mercury. After the innovations, the trio tried several bass players, until, in 1971, a quiet and calm character, John Deacon, joined the group. The group began its first concert tour of the county of Cornwall. During this stage, Freddie's training in graphic design also helped him to create the group's logo. It was also at this time that he met Mary Austin, his most important partner and best friend. The group released its first eponymous album in 1973, and soon became one of the most important bands in rock music. Queen 2 and Sheer Her Attack, both from 1974, preceded the group's big hit A Night at the Opera from 1975, an album that shows Freddie's passion for this musical genre, and of which the masterpiece Bohemian Rhapsody, which stands out for its unusual length of 6 minutes, and the beautiful song Love of My Life, dedicated to his partner and friend Mary Austin, are also part of.
So you think you can stop me and spit my eye?
With a huge success, and with the public in their pockets, the band quickly climbed the music charts, and Freddie became a mass idol for his peculiar style and personality. Although in real life he claimed to be shy, according to his own statements, "When I'm on stage, I'm very outgoing, but inside I'm completely different." During this decade, the popularity acquired by the group's songs even allowed him to make one of his dreams come true, to perform with the Royal Ballet, interpreting and dancing the songs Bohemian Rhapsody and Crazy Little Thing Called Love. There were years of debauchery, in which the singer's crazy parties were constant, and in which he manifested his homosexual orientation and a long list of lovers. In fact, his affair with a record company executive was the one that ended his relationship with Mary Austin. In the 80s, with an enormous popularity beyond the United Kingdom, Freddie Mercury changed his long-haired look for short hair and a mustache, and began a relationship with hairdresser Jim Hutton. This decade included the albums The Game from 1980, Hot Space from 1982, A Kind of Magic from 1986, and outstanding performances such as the Live Aid benefit concert in 1985, one of their most memorable performances. During this decade, the band members also experimented solo. In the case of Freddie, he released 2 solo albums, Mr. Bad Guy in 1985 and Barcelona in 1988, together with the opera singer Montserrat Cabal. In the 90s, in the midst of a tremendous success, his excesses began to take their toll, and the AIDS he had contracted in 1986, which he had strongly denied suffering from, marked the last years of his career. There came a time when his physical deterioration and the decrease in tours and concerts began to raise suspicions, so he ended up confessing it publicly at a press conference on November 24, 1991. A day later, the iconic artist died of pneumonia complicated by AIDS. He had lived his last years in seclusion with his partner, Jim Hutton, but despite this, he bequeathed most of his fortune and the rights to his lyrics to his faithful friend Mary Austin. Freddie Mercury's death shocked the music scene, with a succession of tribute concerts such as the one held at London's Wembley Arena, in which artists such as Elton John, Metallica, George Michael, or David Bowie took part. However, his fans received the best posthumous gift with the release of Queen's Made in Heaven, a work in which they could listen to the last songs Freddie composed before his death. The Mercury Phoenix Trust, an NGO to help people suffering from HIV, was also created in his honor. Freddie was named the greatest rock legend of all time, according to a British poll, and a statue was erected in his honor in the Swiss town of Montreux, where he spent long periods of time. Queen enters the select list of the most successful bands of all time, with over 200 million recorded sales worldwide, and Freddie Mercury, who specialized in stardom, while giving new meaning to the concept of sense of theatricality, left a legacy of songs, which will never lose their stature as classics, because they will live forever. Thanks for everything, Freddie Mercury.
Came as a surprise. I spoke